So good afternoon. So I will sit between you and the lunch after talking about a lot of cool stuff, and I'm going to excite you about oil and gas, right? So before I start to the core of my presentation, I would like to give you a crash course on exploration and production. So you understand that it's not exactly like There Will Be Blood or only like Macondo or like this industry retaining information about climate change, okay? There is a lot of cool stuff that we're doing. So I'm going to take the challenge in 5 minutes to explain you how we are doing. So the first thing you are doing when you want to go into exploration and production is that you bring a bunch of geologists and they look at the earth and they say, seems like that there could be some oil. And they come and they do various analysis and field trip and come back and say, I think we should invest. And the next step is that then you bring the seismic survey, whether it is on marine or on land, which is basically you're going to create seismic event, thousands, millions of them, and you will read the reflection of the earth to try to get an image of what is in the subsurface. So right off, you're going to invest a few hundred millions just to guess a bit better whether there is actually something happening down there. And then you will collect all this information and you will bring a bunch of geologists, geophysicists working together for months and months. I didn't mention that the seismic survey by itself is already going to take a couple years. So now you bring all these very skillful people that spend many years studying, and they will analyze all this information, all these signals, and come up to try to understand whether there is actually potentially oil there. Which means that they have to understand that there is some source rock that back in the days, let's say 60 million years ago, produced hydrocarbon. That is, this hydrocarbon migrated to a certain place where there was actually a trap to capture this hydrocarbon. And then finally that there was a seal on top of it so that hydrocarbon didn't escape to the earth or to the surface or somewhere else. So you bring all that together, you analyze for months and months, and you come to say, here I think that we should drill. And then come the next investment. You're going to spend about 150 million to maybe 500 million doing an exploration well. You're going to drill that. And 60% of the well we drill are dry, meaning that there is no oil. So you spent all that money. Then once you really decide that it seems that there is something there, then you bring another breed of educated person that's called the reservoir engineer. He understands about the reservoir, he understands about the fluid within the reservoir, and they start to build a better understanding of what's actually under the surface. And then they will again analyze for a certain number of years, and then they will finally decide that we have to build a development plan for this potential reservoir, meaning that maybe we'll have to build roads, maybe we'll have to bring waters, maybe we'll have to figure out what we're going to do with all the waters that we will produce, because you may or may not know, but many of the oil fields are actually producing more water than oil. So you get with this massive amount of water that you need to process, and you just cannot just deal with that by living there. So you go into this field development, and finally you go into production. And the next challenge is kicking on, is the fact that if you don't do anything, your production will decline, and may decline very quickly. Meaning that after a couple years, in fact in the unconventional, after a couple months, things start to not go so great. So for that, you need to have an understanding accurate of what's happening again under the surface to try to understand what you need to do to get to the production that's going to be a viable production. And finally, many years after, you will decommission this field and try to clean the situation that hopefully we are doing better and better. So that was just trying to give you a sense of the various challenges that we are addressing in this industry. So Schlumberger, what we're doing is that we are a service company operating in that exploration and production environment, and we are providing services along the three main elements, which is the reservoir characterization, which starts from the very early days of this seismic I talked about, down to the point where we have a field development plan that we know what we're going to do. Then we have the drilling, which is this large, expensive operation of drilling the wells. And if you look at something that in a deep water environment, frankly, drilling a well in that environment is about the same level of complexity of space mission. So you are dealing with extreme complexity, and everything can have a significant cost and significant risk, safety, environmental. I mean, unfortunately, we know too well what happened in the Gulf with Macondo. And then production is about, indeed, making sure that your reservoir will continue to produce, and that's where we have various techniques that we are providing to the oil company to do with that. Okay, the financial, just to give a sense of the size of the company. You may not have heard much about Schlumberger if you're not in that domain. We're not a company that is advertising a lot. One of the reasons is that we're operating in so many countries that we decided to have a bit of a low profile. But we are pretty sizable company. And if you look at the revenue, that's after a drop of about 45 to 50% that happened with the oil and gas crisis that we are in the middle of. So that's just another numbers in terms of what's happening. You can see that we are drilling 70 million feet per year. That's the number of operating hours that we are delivering to our customer. So let's move to a little bit of the topic of this presentation. So we are in an industry where we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty. You basically just do your best guess about what's happening in the subsurface. We have huge safety environment and challenges. They can be environmental or they can be related to people, and the consequences of our actions are pretty dramatic for people's life and environmental. We are dealing with very complex system, with a science that is extremely complex, describing all this physical interaction in this complex system. And we're dealing with massive investment, as I mentioned at a few points in this first crash course about exploration and production. So how do we move to get to the next level? How do we move from making the work more efficient to actually change the work itself? One thing that, looking at all these different technology, and it was interesting to hear about that in the previous presentations we got, is I fairly believe that a lot is about the interactions. What is changing with this technology is how we are interacting, how humans are interacting with machines, how machines are interacting with machines, and how humans are interacting with humans. If you look at it, that's really where things are fundamentally changing in this new technology. So because of the complexity of the world I described, in fact, Schlumberger has been investing in software for many decades. It's interesting because sometime in some survey, oil and gas appears as a bit behind in terms of adoption of the digital technology. But we've been building numerical simulation to simulate what's happening within the reservoir with very, very complex software, leveraging high-performance computing already in the late 80s. We built 3D modeling tools that allow us to bring all this information that we are collecting to make some interpretation and support the geophysicist and the geologist to really understand or try their best guess about what is happening in the subsurface. We've been using neural network for 20 years to help the geophysicist to interpret this seismic, which is basically an imaging to understand what's happening in the subsurface. And finally, we've been using analytics for many decades as well to figure out, with all the production data, what is going to be the decline curve that we should expect and how this will go down. So one thought that I have when I look at all that is that many of these technologies are not new. Anthony mentioned, yes, I was playing with computer at the age of 10, which was in 77, so was not so common at the time to have access to a computer. And I grew up with this computer science all around me for a long time. So, in fact, cloud, in some ways, definitely around data science, artificial intelligence, IoTs, natural language interface, all these things have been there for quite some time. But the reality is that they've been limited in their ability to expand because of the reliability, because of the constraint on computing power, because of the constraint on memory and interconnection. And I think that what's happening today is that this friction that we're preventing all this technology to invade everywhere are getting to such a low point that we start to see that all around us. And that's why it's a very interesting moment that we are living, where in the history of business, we always had disruption happening. All the business have been disrupted at one point in their history. But what's happening now is that this disruption is happening across, because these technologies can be applied to so many different environments. So I'm using this analogy of muscle to mind. If we look at the first industrial revolution, that was really the starting point of how can we amplify the human muscle. What we are living today is how can we amplify the human brain. I think that the AI, human assisted by AI, as was presented earlier, how we're interacting with machine and the machine able to take some reasoning and help us with that is something that will drastically change our world in the next few years. So combine the interaction with artificial intelligence and the amplification of the human brain, that is creating a starting point for a very different world. And it's on us to decide if we want to make that world a better world or not. So now going down from this high-level thought to maybe something a little bit more pragmatic and give you a bit of illustration of the different things that we've been doing. So the first one is about our internal Schlumberger transformation. We embarked several years back, it was in 2012, into a complete rethinking of the way we are operating. It's not about what we are delivering, but the way we are operating. We were becoming a huge company. At the time, we were 140,000 employees. We had 120 different nationalities, so very much in terms of diversity, and they are represented from the bottom of the organization to the CEO suite in terms of the diversity. But we wanted to make sure that we can make our size a strength and not something that will prevent us to move. So we started to rethink all the processes, and we started to bring, at that point, the thinking of how can we leverage technology to help us. And that was a very interesting duality kind of situation, because the reality is that we have been investing in business system a long time ago, and we were struggling with old and dying business systems. So we decided to embark into a massive SAP implementation. Not exactly what many of you will think about the latest cool technology. It was very much indeed the playbook of the last decade, not the playbook of the next decade. So our challenge was how to bring that together, and how can we, at the same time we are investing so massively into building this foundation with our SAP implementation, how can we leverage the digital technology? And we tackled that from the data. We tackled that from decoupling from all this massive SAP implementation, starting leveraging the buzzwords that you all have heard of data lake, to start building this decoupling, and invested into a combined team, small team, agile, made of data scientists, domain expert, and IT expert, and bring them to explore and solve these new business challenges in the way we rethink the way we work. And that's how we rebuilt an entire data strategy. We are at the stage now of building our next iteration of our data strategy that has created for us an opportunity to innovate while we are investing into this massive SAP implementation. The second example I would like to give is what we've been doing around seismic processing. So as I said, once we have the bunch of geologists at their good time doing some field trip and deciding that seems to be a cool place to spend a couple $100 million, that's where the seismic is coming. And here I'm presenting on the marine aspect. You can see on the right side the amount of data that we are generating by day. And you can see how this amount of data is growing. And this is data that we actually have to analyze. This is signal. This is the reflection of the seismic event that is reflected by the different layers of the earth that is coming back. And based on all that, we have to make sense to produce an image of the subsurface. It's extraordinarily complex. A typical marine survey takes about 2 years. Out of that, a large part is the time to process all this data because of the complexity. So we've been investing for quite some time in high-performance computing. We've been leveraging GPUs as a way to scale in terms of the computing power. But in the last couple of years, we made the move to cloud. And that was recently announced at the Google event, cloud event, that we've been partnering with Google to leverage the cloud in terms of accessing to virtually an unlimited computing power to be able to process that. And when you combine this capability, so that's a representation of a 3D model of the subsurface. So when you combine this capability that we are getting from the cloud in terms of unlimited computing power, and we bring artificial intelligence and machine learning, not to do very simple tasks, in fact, but to be able to take on a lot of the work that these geophysicists have been doing to interpret all this signal. In fact, we realized through a lot of innovative experience that have been happening in the last 3 years that there is actually a lot we can do through machine learning to take on the job not of the low-level type of activity, but the activities that today are done by someone who is a graduate student and have been working in the industry for 10, 20 years. Recently, the team brought me to one of our technology center, and basically I had a challenge with the machine versus the 30 years experienced geophysicist. And we were doing the seismic interpretation. And my role, because I'm not a geoscientist, was to click on one button. And his role was to do actually going through that. And at the end of the 15 minutes, that was the time for the challenge, it turns out that my prediction in terms of the seismic interpretation was actually pretty good without any knowledge, just the knowledge on pushing on one button. So what we're discovering is that there is a lot we can do in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning, even included at the knowledge worker. And now we can empower those knowledge workers so they can focus on the zone where there is complexity of interpretation. It's not very clear. It's much more complex to understand what's happening. And then now they can focus on these kind of things. The next example I would like to highlight is around well construction. So by well construction, we are really talking about drilling. So you want to drill a well. It's an entire process that will bring a lot of people together, a lot of different companies together to be able to produce a well that will deliver what you are expecting, whether it is an exploration well to understand what is in the subsurface, or whether it is a development well that you intend to produce from or there are some technology where sometimes you use a well to in fact inject to manage the pressure for what's in the subsurface. So this is a very complex process. Again, as I said, I mean, an offshore rig can easily cost in the hundreds of millions a day just to have your rig on site. And then you need to drill for a month or 2 months. And if there is any event that is happening and you have non-productive time that is happening, if your rig is not able to be used for actually drilling, it just costs you about 100 million a day. So we better do that very efficiently. Now, when it comes to the unconventional, and if you want to drill on land, where you are going there is the efficiency. Today, a well cost about on unconventional will cost about 30, 40 million. We want to go down to 8 million. The price of oil is not going to go back to $200 for all our prediction. So we better have to find ways where we can operate at a much lower cost. So what we've done is that we've done a complete rethinking of the entire drilling process. We've observed how all the parties are interacting. We've observed all the activities that are happening in the drilling, all the one that can be physically automated with robots, machine robots, physical robots, and also the task that can be logically automated and anticipated. And we've rebuilt an entire platform that allows all these people to work in a collaborative environment with a full understanding of what's happening at any point in time, in real time. The machine and the system ensuring that there is a continuous hands-off that is happening with nothing dropping from all these different players. And also the machine is constantly providing insight about what's happening to make sure that we are acting if there is something that is not happening as per the expectation of what the geophysicist and the geologist design in terms of the subsurface. Because when you drill, that's the first time you're going to realize what's actually down there. So these were just a couple of points of, it's just another slide, a couple of points of what we've been doing internally. We have our internal forum that is happening in September. That's probably of no interest for most of you here. But it's quite exciting because that's where we're going to present and announce to the world a lot of the work that we've been doing in the last few years around data and big data and analytics, around machine learning and artificial intelligence, around new collaborative environment. And even more importantly, I will say how to bring all these pieces together and make them operating in a very efficient manner, which has been a big challenge in our industry so far. Thank you.